And this presentation basically, as I just mentioned, presents our first pilot data in the European context in which we want to validate the research done by Kirk in the US context. And today we're going to talk about three different things. First, we're going to look at the attributes that facilitate diffusion related to the tool. The second part of the presentation will focus on elements of virtual team. So what makes a team more or less likely to be successful. And the third part of the webinar will focus on metaphors for e-infrastructure. And in the first part of the presentation, our main theory is the diffusion of innovations theory by Everett Rogers, which is actually the most cited theory in the field, in the entire field of communication. And Rogers' theory focuses on the question, what makes an innovation more or less likely to be adopted in a social system? And he found that, maybe in contrast to popular belief, it's not always the best innovations that get adopted widely. Some really good innovations are not adopted, while other innovations are adopted. And he wanted to make a model explaining when the chances of an innovation being adopted would be largest. And he describes this model by using the metaphor of diffusion. And the metaphor of diffusion basically is illustrated in this slide. So you first have a cup of water, which is the social system, and then you put the innovation in the social system, which is the drop of ink. And then if diffusion is successful, you see the ink spreading across the social system, leading to larger adoption. And this metaphor is then applied to the spreading of innovation. So the question is, what makes an innovation more or less likely to be adopted? And particularly in our work, we've applied this model to the spreading of innovations related to cyber infrastructure in the US and e-infrastructure in Europe. And for this, to answer these questions, Kirk has acquired a number of grants from the National Science Foundation, and they are related to his VOS grant. And I'm now happy to give the floor to Kirk to explain the ideas of his grant and to talk us through the first part of the presentation, focusing on tool adoption and virtual teams.
Great, thank you, Christian, for that opening. So on the slide right now, this is a visual showing two aspects of the research from an NSF VOS grant that I've been working on here in the US to understand what drives the adoption of uh, cyber infrastructure or e-infrastructure innovations in the US. So briefly, as you can see, we have the visual of the dark oval bubble showing the first virtual organization, VO number one in e-science. This can be from any domain, let's say is from bioinformatics. And there is a tool that was developed out of this particular virtual organization. And we want to understand what may drive that tool to spread from virtual organization number one to virtual organization number two. And the premise that we started with is there's something about the tool, and also there's something about the virtual organization that drive the success of that tool. As you can see, the tool will then get adopted and implemented and modified in virtual organization number two, let's say is computational chemistry as another field. The tool can then evolve and become a new version, and that's why the color changes a little bit. And then that tool continue to spread to other domains. So of course, this is the ideal situation, but it captures the premise and the assumptions behind what drives this particular research. So if we can go to the next slide. So the next slide is where we discuss how we adopted this research that started in the US here in an NSF grant that I've been working on to the EU context. So in collaboration with Christian and Alan, and through the blessing of Yin, we were able to actually collect a pilot survey of about 13 responses from from what we consider pretty diverse stakeholder groups, even though it's only a small subset. But this subset included opinions and input from developers, users, and some educators. As you can see, the domains represented by this small subset of participants is also quite diverse. We listed a few here: life sciences, earth sciences, climate science, space physics, etc., etc. The range of experience is also quite huge, ranging anywhere between 1 to 25 years, uh, and also the range of tool that participants responded to and discussed have a pretty wide range of 3 to 25 years as well. And the quick sense of the gender representation in the data is it is predominantly male, which is also in a way representative of the community, even though we would like to see more diversity and increase of other perspective as well. So hopefully in a larger data set, as we continue to collect more data, we'll see more female input on the survey as well. So let's go to the next slide, slide number 7. So as we discussed earlier, during the introduction before the recording, the the data was actually collected earlier this year in April and May of 2018 at two conferences held in the EU context. And what we did there was we collected data to understand how the findings from the US context may be applicable also to the EU context. All right, let's move to slide number 8. So back to this visual again, just to remind us what are some of the questions that we're after. The first section that I want to share with you all is the two attributes. So what are some of the two attributes that drive successful adoption of e-infrastructure innovations? All right, let's go to the next slide. All right, so here's a list of 10 attributes. Just a little bit of background, these 10 attributes actually came from the data sets in the US. The US project here, we conducted about more than 100 interviews. And so we conducted interviews with a wide range of stakeholders as well, including administrators, developers, users, educators, and people who play multiple roles. And after we generated the 10 attributes, we presented the result at the 2016 XSEDE conference held in the US. What we did with the survey in EU in April and May 2018 was we actually asked the European participants to rate and rank the importance of these attributes in influencing the adoption of these infrastructure innovations in the context of EU. And here is the ranking based on a score, average score for each of the attributes. And the range of the score is ranging from 1 to 7. Next slide, please. So in the interest of time, I'm just going to quickly go over the first 5 attributes. The first 5 attributes, we start from the one with the highest score. As you can see, the one with the higher score is actually perceived needs. And what is interesting here is in some of the diffusion innovations literature, the theoretical framework that Christian introduced in the beginning of this presentation, the idea of perceived needs usually is subsumed under the idea of relative advantage. So the discussion has always been if an innovation is relatively more advantageous, it will be uh, uh, adopted more readily. What we tested, if we can backtrack the slide to number 10, the previous slide, just for 1 second. So on this slide, you can see needs turn out to be number 1, and relative advantage is actually number 7. So we actually compare and contrast the two, both of these factors, and it turned out that driven by needs is actually the number 1 attribute. which I think is not surprising, given the community often talk about this as a driving factor, but it's also important to actually have the evidence, the data, the quantitative data to actually document this. So let's go back to slide number 11. So one of the things that we wanted to achieve with this research was, in addition to identifying the particular factor, we also want to raise one or two quick questions to help developers and members of e-infrastructure teams and projects to ask themselves some questions to help them identify how they can improve the likelihood of their innovations being adopted. So a question that they can ask internally is, does this tool or does our tool meet the needs of the users? We phrase this particular question from a perspective of the user when they're considering adoption of the tool. All right, let's move to the next slide, slide 12. So the second attribute that drives adoption is actually documentation. We wanted to highlight this as an important factor, as the number two factor, which turns out very interesting because in a lot of e-infrastructure projects, because it is open source, many of the pro- many of the technologies are open source. So documentation is critical in helping users adopt and implement the technology. However, in a lot of projects, because the primary focus is so much on developing the prototype technology and also to put the technology to actually enable some science to be done and research to be done immediately, documentation sometimes turns out to be a secondary concern or sometimes even an oversight. In a lot of the projects, um, in this space, documentation sometimes is done not to the fullest extent to assist with adoption. And sometimes a team may not even have a dedicated person to give full attention to this particular attribute of documentation. But we want to highlight that in our pilot survey, documentation turns out to be actually a very, very important factor in predicting adoption. And so a question to guide the team to consider while developing a tool is the tool well documented with a track record and user guides? All right, slide number 13, please. So the third one related to the idea of open source and documentation is the idea of community driven, because it is a community and the infrastructure and the technologies serve a community from the user standpoint. Before they adopt, they want to see if there's a thriving and an active community that is actually carrying the tool forward. So for a lot of the e-infrastructure projects, it is then important to understand that if there isn't a community carrying the tool forward, users will be hesitant in adopting the technology. Therefore, it is actually important to consider a question listed here. Is there an active community that will carry this tool forward? So it is important for the developing team or the project team to actively put some effort in building the community in addition to building the technology. So let's go to slide number 14. Next slide. So the next one is probably a key factor that a lot of people know that will be important, which is simplicity, because this is high-end technology and is usually very sophisticated. So that can be a barrier to adoption. The more simple, the easier the tool for the user, the more likely the tool will be adopted. And this is a pretty straightforward factor and is ranked number 4 out of our pilot data. All right, let's go to slide number 15. So 15 is compatibility, and this theme will surface later on uh, during the third segment of this presentation on metaphor. The essence of compatibility here is the notion of disruption, which Christian will elaborate later on. a little bit more. When a new user of a technology, especially they're moving towards um, the e-infrastructure, e-science, or big data, computational approaches to doing science and research. One thing that ask before the adoption is, can I easily integrate this tool into my existing routine and collaborations? And they have to consider not just their routine, but also the routine of the collaborators. And they also ask, is this tool aligned with the norms of my domain as a whole? Because if it is too different, it's too disruptive, not just in my routine or the routine with my collaborators, as well as within my domain, it will be a high cost to pay. So when the developing team working on the design of the tool, another factor that turned out to be very important is to understand how the tool is compatible with the routine of the potential users and to minimize the disruption as much as possible. All right, let's go to slide number 16. And this is again a review of the list of 10 that we discussed. And because of the interest of time, we only decided to go into the details for the top five. But before we transition to the next section, I want to pause for a second and invite any question, comment, or feedback or any discussions that the participants may have at this point regarding what we have presented so far.
This is Susanna speaking. Thanks for these first slides. I have a question concerning the number of surveys that were collected. Is 13 a sufficient number to draw conclusions?
Very good point. That's a very good question. 13 is a very small pilot data set. It's not statistically significant in any way. What we hope to accomplish is by sharing the preliminary results with interested participants, we can gain some feedback and also to potentially collect more data. And Christian and I have talked about potentially working with Ian to further collect more data because we know this is a very small data set. But this is the biggest data set that we are able to collect so far at the two conferences that we are able to introduce a survey to. So we are by no means trying to make any final conclusion. But in I think it was in June when we presented this preliminary results with Ian and Sergio, we came to the conclusion that even though it is a small data set, it still has some interesting insights that can serve as starting conversations as a jumping off point. So definitely, we do not think that with a small data set of 13 respondents, the findings are in any way conclusive and final. We would like to actually seek input from all of you in terms of how we can further increase more data for this particular study.
This is Bruce. I got another question similarly. So we all know that running these surveys is really difficult, and getting people to answer them in the first place is difficult, but getting the right people to answer them is even more difficult. So I wonder if you have any idea about the personas of people that would respond to your survey. There are many different roles that people would play, and they would bring different motivations and emphasis to these various factors. Can you say something about that?
Definitely. So in the survey, we also collected other information such as the role that they play. Are they developers? Are they users? Are they educators? Are they administrators, etc., etc.? Because we have a small data set right now of n equal to 13, we're not able to make categorical comparisons. But our hope is to be able to increase the number if we are able to get, say, 1,300 respondents in the data set, we'll be able to actually compare the opinions and also the input, the scoring, let's say between developers and users, or developers of certain years of experience versus developers with shorter history with the tool. So definitely we plan to do some categorical comparisons, but we are limited right now by the smaller data set that we have. But it is definitely a very good point that you raised, that we would like to actually pursue this in the future.
Right. So the other thing that I just wanted to mention was that one of the surveys that I know works really well is the Stack Overflow survey. Every year they publish their results about their massive developer survey. This is a little bit aligned with what we're trying to do. In our case, we're trying to build tools and infrastructures for certain communities, whereas in their case, they're surveying professional communities, but they're trying to do the same thing. So they're asking people, which tools do you use, driven by your needs, the documentation, and so on. So I think the methodology there is quite similar. Of course, it's a catch-22. You need a big community to get a big community feedback. And so I was wondering if it would be possible to kind of open source the results of this survey so that they can be iterated upon, and they can be published as some form of open data that we can keep building upon.
That's an interesting question. So Bruce, are you suggesting how can we, if we are interested in pursuing that, what would be the steps that you recommend?
So if you keep doing small surveys, then you'll never reach any kind of scale, right? So you need to be able to iterate upon the results of previous ones. That means that you need to be able to publish a kind of dashboard about the state of things and how they have evolved to this point, and leave that closely linked with the actual survey, right? So when people find out about this thing, they don't just see the results, but they also see how to directly participate in that. So that is some way in which people say, oh, okay, this is an actual ongoing research study. The results so far are this. I want to give my voice as well. And that's, I think, yeah, that's one of the ways that I would address trying to get a decent sample, just to keep the actual activity and the results of the activity linked. Otherwise, people think that it's a done deal and they get discouraged to participate.
Got it. Basically, what you're saying is to make sure that the results actually will get updated in real time. So as more participants provide their input, they can see how their input can change the results as the results are being updated in real time.
Well, I mean, that's going to bias the results. So you might want to do this periodically. But in any case, just say, you give the impression, as in the first case that you mentioned there, people want to participate where there's an active community. This survey itself is an active community. So you need to give that impression too.
Absolutely. Very good input. Thank you. We'll definitely take this suggestion into consideration and work with Ian to consider ways to take this forward. Thank you.